For over 20 years, the old Page Woodson School on 6th and Stonewall sat abandoned. Even though all the doors and windows were boarded up, that unfortunately didn't prevent the inevitable natural decay, break-ins, vandalism, and many fires that occurred inside. However, there was still a lot of history left within its walls.
The chalkboards that still had the assignments on them were still there. The textbooks, there were pictures everywhere of students, teachers. It was just like a normal school that everyone had just picked up and left. Things that went through my mind were what the history was, what caused the building to get into such a state, and you want to learn more about it.
The history begins with Douglas High School, which was originally located where Bricktown Ballpark is today.
The first Douglas was a 2-room building and it burned down. Douglas population was ever expanded because Douglas was the high school that everybody in the black community went to.
It was named after Frederick Douglass, who was an escaped slave that worked to end slavery before and after the Civil War. From the late 1800s to the early 1900s, the population of the African American community continued to grow, and a bigger school was needed.
The laws of Oklahoma stipulated where black folks could live. I mean, it's hard to believe, but we could not go over to 3rd Street or 4th Street or 5th Street. It was, again, we were confined to a small area. White people would have to move out of off of a street before black people could move onto the street.
And when I first got here, the invisible line, it had moved from down in the Deep Deuce area up to Northeast 8th Street. And then they stopped looking at the line so much, but every time the population would grow, there was white flight.
By the late 1930s, they were able to find and renovate a bigger facility that became the new home of the Douglas High School Trojans. This structure was originally the all-white Lowell Elementary School, which was built in 1910 and designed by Leighton Smith and Hawk, with elaborate exterior details, high stone, and plaster craft.
Well, because the white community had moved farther north, and that school became the new home of African Americans. And boy, was that a celebrated occasion. Because the school was built for white students, it had everything in it. I mean, it was a magnificent auditorium.
The new renovations included an Olympic-sized pool that was added by the principal, F.D. Moon.
Because it was a large facility, because of this auditorium, it allowed an area where people could congregate. Large numbers of the community members could congregate because it was a 1,000-seat theater here. African Americans couldn't meet at the Civic Center or at other large venues, and so this became the center point to the African American community.
From sporting events such as football, basketball, and swimming to plays, musicals, and marching bands, Douglas High School had a lot to offer.
I came from the farm, so here, I mean, this was the bright lights. I mean, it was almost like going to the movies, just to sit there and watch the band practice and the majorettes and all that. I had never seen anything like that. Everything about Douglas was exciting. You hear me? I was excited about it. And I just learned to really love going to school. I did.
This center helped every student set a foundation for their future so they could work towards accomplishing their dreams. That excellence from the educators would go on to shape history and carry on the many legacies that came out of the school, starting with Inman E. Page.
Inman Page was born a slave. During the Civil War, he was able to escape through the lines and made his way to freedom.
Page was the principal in the early days of Douglas and led the separate school system for 15 years after becoming the first president of Langston University.
But Inman Page brought the liberal arts. He was at odds with many people in Oklahoma who didn't think that black folks needed to learn to be doctors and lawyers.
It wasn't just Inman Page that contributed to the Douglas High School legacy. Many other notable figures passed through these halls, including Page's daughter,
Zelia N. Bro,
legendary author Ralph Ellison, and F.D. Moon, the principal of Douglas High School from 1940 to 1961. Moon was considered the dean of African American education. He was elected to the Oklahoma City Board of Education in 1972 and served as its first African American president in 1974.
Mr. F.D. Moon, And the teachers were very determined that the students would represent your school to make sure that you were able to put your best foot forward.
With the rapid growth of the community, by the 1950s, the building for the Douglas High School was becoming too small. F.D. Moon was hopeful for a bright future and sought to build a bigger educational facility on Martin Luther King Avenue, just a few blocks away. After 1955, the old Douglas building was turned into an elementary school, followed by a fifth-year center in 1975 that recognized both Inman E. Page and the father of Black History Month, Carter G. Woodson.
We had more history and more people that we wanted to recognize than we had places for them to be recognized. So those two names, Woodson and Page and Woodson, were synonymous with great educators.
Fifth-year centers were experimented with in Oklahoma City, and most failed due to low enrollment rates, dispersion of population, and desegregation. Because of this, the oldest remaining Douglas High School structure shut its doors in 1994, with no plans in sight.
When the doctors moved out, the lawyers moved out, the preachers moved out, the teachers moved out, what was left? That was the beginning of the major transformation that has occurred.
It didn't take long for this important cornerstone to start decaying. Passerbyers were constantly breaking in to either keep warm in the winter or steal something of value.
Believe it or not, every time some incident would happen where somebody was living in the building, my phone would ring. People would call and they would say, "Anita, there's somebody living in that building." You would have thought that I was the police department or the fire department, because they would call me and tell me. I said, "Well, call the police. They're not going to do anything." You know, that's what they said.
I was hopeful that something would happen with it because I believed that it had such an architectural heritage that in Oklahoma at the time wasn't something that we were very good at. The early 2000s, mid-90s, there were tons of abandoned buildings like this. Even though our state, is only barely 100 years old, it doesn't mean that this building built, in the 1920s doesn't hold any type of architectural pedigree.
As the years went on, Page Woodson continued to sit. Eventually, there were rumors of demolition due to the broken windows, rotting floors, and graffiti covering every inch of the inside. But all of that changed in 2013 when the school was purchased by developers Ron Bradshaw and his son, Jason Bradshaw.
So this is the neighborhood and the community that I came to and grew up. And this site came to the forefront as being extremely important to the community.
The Page Woodson project isn't just restoring an old school. It's attempting to bring back the historic neighborhood and provide ample housing for the area.
Like breathing new life into this old building that had such history. And I think just the light in the whole building. When we came in, all the windows were covered up. It was a dark, dark space. And so just replacing all the windows to me is like, it really, brought the light in and just transformed everything.
The classrooms, the gym, and the pool have been converted into apartments, while the most notable feature of the building was restored to its original use.
The auditorium was probably the biggest landmark. It's been a big, really expensive process, to be honest with you.
That was a challenge, taking all the seats out, building the dance floor, seeing the seats and everything after they come back from being restored. That was awesome.
I think what makes a city unique, it begins with what's visual. It begins with the buildings. They don't build buildings like this anymore. It's amazing to see it. It makes me smile.
The school is important because it represents the thirst that we had for education. We should celebrate the accomplishments of the people that came before us, and we can do that by preserving the story.
Gina and all the parties involved, they have worked very hard to keep that history. And to the extent that you can preserve a building, or if you're repurposing it with history in mind, you're doing a lot for humanity.
What would it have meant to you if the old Douglas School was demolished?
It occurs to me and has occurred to me while I was working on this project that built environment reinforces your existence every day. You see it, you experience it. Unconsciously, it tells you that you're significant. When African American communities are torn down, places of historical significance are torn down, it reinforces that we're insignificant, that our history doesn't matter. If you think about it, when something is torn down, how long does it take before you have forgotten that it ever existed? I am very passionate that when you tear down my history, you tear down my children's future. They don't see it. I can tell them about it, but it means so much more when I can take them someplace and let them see and feel that history. Most of our city really does understand now historic preservation is really important. It brings vibrancy to the city, it adds interest to our city, it communicates to others that they were significant, that they were important, that they create things of beauty, that they are relevant, and they were relevant to society.